Hello and welcome. My name is Manesh Samtani. I'm the editor at Regulation Asia. I'll be moderating today's session, Fortifying Your Fraud Prevention Strategy Against Sophisticated Scams. First off, let me thank the audience. Thank you to all of you who have dialed in to listen to this conversation. I'd like to thank the Asian Bankers Association and LexisNexis Risk Solutions for putting this event together. And of course, for allowing me to host this discussion on such an important topic. Now, in the last few years, we've seen our region experience a rapid digitalization of financial services. We all love the speed and convenience, but a side effect, of course, has been that this presents opportunities for criminals to target businesses and consumers with the different types of frauds and scams. Across APAC, we've seen new regulatory requirements aimed at addressing frauds and scams, government initiatives like national scam centers, public education campaigns, unprecedented collaboration between law enforcement, regulators, and the private sector, and of course, a significant investment in technology by banks and other FIs to combat this threat. So we're here today to hear a bit about fraud detection and prevention from a true expert in this field. You'll hear about fraud trends, statistics, different types of frauds and scams, the use of biometrics, intelligence, behavioral analysis, and other techniques to combat this activity. Our expert today is Tan Tai Vo, Director of Market Planning for Fraud and Identity for APAC at LexisNexis Risk Solutions. Now, Tai has about 20 years experience in technology and risk consulting with a very particular focus on digital fraud in Asia. We will have a 20-minute Q&A session afterwards. So I would like to remind all the listeners to submit questions throughout the discussion. Before we begin, on behalf of the Asian Bankers Association, I would like to invite you all to the 2023 ABA conference in Kathmandu, Nepal. As shown on the screen, the two-day event will be held on November 9th and 12th in Kathmandu, Nepal. The theme of the conference will be Asian Banking, Roadmap for Recovery and Sustained Growth. So of course, the event is designed to provide a platform for ABA members to meet and network with each other, exchange views with experts, government officials, regulators, and other bankers from Asia Pacific and beyond. Please do visit the conference website to see the program, hotel information, and other details. The website information, I think, is being posted in the chat box. And without further ado, I'd like to pass the floor to Tai to share with us some of his experience and learnings, in sort of combating fraud and working on fraud detection. Thanks very much, Tai.
Thanks, Manesh, for the introduction. So let me do a quick introduction about myself before we get into the presentation. I started my corporate journey in consulting, and that was 20 years ago, working at Pricewaterhouse, Deloitte, and Fortifying, a specialized risk consulting firm. About 10 years ago, I made the switch to technology, initially working with GRC solutions, governance, risk, and compliance, and then later moving to fraud and identity solutions. All right, so I will start the presentation. So if you cannot see it, do let me know. Okay, I hope you can see the screen.
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, let's okay, once again, welcome to this webinar with a focus on scam, as Manesh just mentioned, and we will also briefly look at how the path of fraud and financial crime compliance are converging. In this digital age where technology connects us, there is an unfortunate dark side, which is cybercrime. online fraud and scams have evolved into a lucrative business for cyber criminals. They employ various methods such as phishing, fake website, data breaches, and social engineering to trick unsuspecting victims into sharing their sensitive information and coercing victims into transferring funds from their own account to scammers. So this scam often exploit human vulnerability, relying on trust and urgency to manipulate targets. This session is cover 4 broad areas, although they are very much interconnected. In the first section, we take a high-level snapshot of the current fraud landscape to provide a bit more context to this topic of the webinar. I will then revisit some of the common scam scenario, and this flows into the discussions of challenges in scam detection using conventional techniques and how behavioral analysis is able to address these gaps with a multi-layered fraud prevention strategy. And towards the end of the session, we briefly look at the convergence of fraud and financial crime and how regulators are responding to this trend. To kick things off, we follow a digital identity during a typical day to illustrate the concept of digital intelligence and how we can leverage digital intelligence in the fight against online fraud. All actors in the digital economy leave a digital footprint, whether they are a typical consumer or actors with more malicious intent. As they move along the customer journey, we can uncover more data fragments from these actors. For example, individuals may use email to set up a new account, or they use credit card to pay for online purchases. Some individuals may use one or multiple devices for online transactions. As they move, in this example, the user tries to set up an account by analyzing the contextual data of hundreds of data attributes. We can assess the risk of the particular transactions. Around the same time, the user attempts to make a purchase in another part of the world, and the risk analysis of this event indicates that this is a high-risk event. In this very simplified example, we note a few high-risk activity. One is the distance anomaly. Unless the person has a teleport machine, the large distance between these two events raises red flags. We also observed that the digital identity was connected to unknown device within a short time frame when they attempted to make that purchase. And this could also indicate that the bad actors has taken over the account of that user and make an unauthorized transaction. Looking at a broader perspective, we processed and risk assessed 96 billion transactions last year, which translate to around 5,000 transactions per second. The data from this transaction forms the basis of the LexisNexis Digital Identity Network, a repository of crowdsourced and tokenized data from our entire customer base. So using this intelligence, we build reliable, anonymized digital identities of every online user as they transact across locations, devices, and digital businesses. So within this digital identity network, we deliver risk assessment on some of the key data attributes that you see here. So I highlight 2.5 billion phone numbers, 9 billion devices and this include mobile, tablet, and desktop, 2.5 billion digital identity, 3.5 billion email addresses, and 2 billion IP addresses. So let's look at the breakdown of the 96 billion transactions along the customer journey and by use case. Better risk decision can be made when intelligence is gathered throughout the customer journey, from the point at which the consumer opens a new account, then through the life cycle of that account, looking at things like password resets, details changes, and login right through to the point where payment is made. The core use cases are shown here by the larger boxes: new account creation, payment, and logs in, where we see the higher transaction volume of 54 billion transactions. Overall, we continue to see new account creations as the key risk point in the customer journey. These transactions are attacked at the highest rate of all use cases. So around in 11 transactions is a potential attack. Having said that, login have seen the largest growth in attack rate in 2022, as fraudsters look to take over accounts created during the pandemic, as many businesses increase their online presence. The password reset attack rate via mobile app channels saw a significant growth supporting account takeover attacks. And we also saw significant growth in bot attacks across all types of digital payment. We have seen a rise in scams across Asia Pacific, as Manesh mentioned, and this development is reflected in the increase of reported numbers and losses. Authorities are now taking firm steps to address this issue with new and or updated fraud regulation and with establishment of scam alert centers. The upward fraud trend can also be observed in the LexisNexis Digital Identity Network. We recently published the latest cybercrime report, and it covers a wide range of topics and fraud trends at the global and regional levels. So this slide showed what we call our identity abuse index, which shows the percentage of attacks per day across our entire global network. We have plotted a full 2 years of data for 2021 and 2022. You can see a clear increase in attack during the first 18 months, coinciding with economies around the world reopening and restrictions being lifted. During the last 6 months of 2022, the identity abuse index stabilized at this high level. Sometimes we see large spikes in attack rate when a specific organization are targeted or specific data breaches are being reused by various fraudsters around the globe. And some of them are highlighted here. So now we zoom in to get a more detailed view of the regional fraud landscape using 2 countries, an example, as they publish detailed and up-to-date numbers on scams and fraud. So I use Singapore and Australia as an example. Much of the public attention has focused on third-party fraud, such as phishing, identity theft, account takeover, and so on. In terms of volume or numbers of reported incidents, phishing has consistently ranked at the top of the fraud pyramid, as shown in these graphs, using official data from Australia ScamWatch and Singapore Scam Alert. However, when we shift the focus to the financial implication, investment scams have resulted in significantly higher financial losses for the victims. Investment scam is a form of authorized boost payment and is much harder to detect with conventional fraud detection techniques. Please keep in mind that these are reported incidents and losses. The actual amount could therefore be higher than these reported numbers. The above example also highlight one of the challenges when we discuss scam in APAC. And that is there is no single definition of what a scam is. In Europe, a scam scenario is when you make the payment or authorize the payment yourself, also referred to as authorized boost payment. In Asia, scam may refer to a broader definition of online fraud. In the next few minutes, I will revisit some of the common fraud scenarios. The most basic scenario is known as third-party fraud. The victim is unaware of unauthorized account access, so bad actors use different techniques to gain access to the victim accounts, such as phishing, data breaches, or stolen credentials. Once the bad actors have taken over the account, they move the funds out of the account. This is the most common type of fraud in terms of reported incidents. Impersonation scam involve a combination of social engineering tactics whereby the victims share authentication details or credentials with fraudsters. Some of the scenario may include directing the victim to fake website to fish for credentials. In other scenario, bad actors impersonate law enforcement officers to coerce the victim into sharing personal information, or by impersonating bank officers with a warning that the victim's account has been locked and request for credential and OTP to unlock their account. And of course, once the bad actors have gained access to the victim's accounts, the funds will be moved out while the victims are unaware of these unauthorized transactions. In more sophisticated fraud and scam scenario also involve impersonation tactics, but the key difference here is with the other example is that the victim moved the funds or authorized this transaction themselves, also known as authorized push payment fraud. Example of these scams are investment, romance scams, and money mules. So in this example, I will use investment scam as the base scenario. So in this case, the scammer poses as an investment broker and offers the victim investment opportunities. However, it is the victim that logs into the account and transfer the funds to the scammer. The risk signals of an APP fraud scenario are very different from the signals of a typical third-party fraud scenario that we see earlier. And I will return to this topic in the next section. And in terms of financial impact, APP fraud is the top fraud scenario in some of the market that we have seen. Fraud is borderless, and that won't be a surprise observation to most of you. And this fraud network map illustrates this point well. What it shows are fraud linkages using digital identity based on Q4 data of last year. Only organizations with incoming fraud into Singapore banks have been included in this network. I use Singapore as an example, but we can draw up a similar fraud network map for other countries in the region as well. Each arrow illustrates digital identity associated with confirmed fraud attempts at one organization, and then crossing over to another organization in our digital identity network. A thicker arrow denotes a higher volume of fraudulent digital identity. So for illustration, we follow a case of identity fraud using stolen email address. So in this case, one particular stolen email address was used in 35 attempted new account creation across 9 financial institutions. And this activity involved 18 devices, and all this activity happens play out over a 3 months period. So this example also illustrates the multiplier effect. In this case, one stolen email address was used 35 times to create new fraudulent accounts. As organizations optimize their fraud model, an important factor to consider is where the money is being transferred to. The current scam pandemic has grown hand in hand with the surge in mule accounts around the globe. While mules are often considered a more financial crime problem, supporting money laundering and terrorism financing, for example, mules also play a significant role in scams and network fraud schemes, often recruited through social engineering tactics such as deceptive job advertisement on social media platforms. The victims may unknowingly participate in illegal activities. This mule problem has multiplied in recent years thanks to the expansion of digital, social media, and commercial channels. And so in this example, from our digital identity network, within a matter of minutes, money from an account at Bank A was split up and sent to different beneficiary account at Bank C before accumulating again in a single account at Bank C. It is difficult to track money flows across banks and accounts, and these linkages are identified through the payment being initiated by a single digital identity in this example. So an optimized mule detection model, whether used in fraud prevention or broader financial crime monitoring, must leverage digital identity intelligence in order to create a multidimensional analysis of the network. As social engineering scams have increased in complexity, we see that businesses have shifted the focus from typical device intelligence to behavioral analysis. So behavioral biometric intelligence offers a further layer of protection and authentication through the ability to recognize behavioral anomalies to deliver more effective fraud defenses. And we will look at some of these scenarios in more detail in the next section. So far, we have looked at different types of fraud. So you may ask how we actually measure the impact of it. It can be difficult to quantify the true cost of fraud because fraud has wider implications than some businesses may realize. Besides the financial loss to the business, other costs may be overlooked or not sufficiently quantified to provide a complete picture of the true cost of fraud. So we illustrate the concept of LexisNexis fraud multiplier in this simplified example. So adding up the direct and indirect costs will provide a more complete picture of the true cost of fraud. The results from our study indicate that for every monetary unit of the direct loss, the fraud multiplier is close to 4 times that loss. Financial services industry has the highest multiplier, and it is somewhat expected. Financial services industry is one of the most heavily regulated sector. So the regulatory costs are the key contributing factor. E-commerce and retail sectors have lower multipliers than the APEC average. We have briefly discussed APP or authorized push payment fraud earlier. In this scenario, the victims are making the transfer from their own accounts. What makes APP fraud hard to detect is that the risk profile is different from the common types of third-party fraud. So let's use account takeover as a simplified example. When a bad actor takes over an account and logs in, the risk profile of that account changes because, for example, IP address, geolocation, behavior, and device information, etc., are different and may have already been flagged in our digital identity network. So this is illustrated on the left-hand side using 7 data attributes for illustration. So in this example, we can see that the account has been compromised as indicated by the high risk score. In an APP fraud or scam scenario, on the right-hand side, the victim is being coached to execute a number of payments from own accounts. So when the victim logs into the account, it appears as a normal login. But when we analyze additional signal, the risk profile changes, and that becomes more apparent that the account owner is the victim of a scam. Combating online fraud is not simply deploying technology and the problem will go away. A more effective fraud prevention strategy requires a layered approach that combines different elements. Of course, there is no one-size-fits-all approach, so I will walk through some of the key elements. So digital intelligence, this is a key element that we have discussed in the first section, so I will move on to the next one. Transaction monitoring. Perhaps this user logs in at the end of the month to pay bill and check the balance. So the behavioral pattern and the average amount are known to the bank. If suddenly the user sends unusually large amount to unknown locations, unknown recipient, these are indicators of behavioral anomalies. Also, behavioral insights. In addition to profiling the user or the sender, we extend the capability to look at the risk profile of the recipient or the beneficiary. For instance, the user had received many inbounds payment before the current transaction. This could be a risk indicator of a typical mule activity, or the user is trying to send small amount into multiple accounts to hide red flags. It is a risk indicator for typical money laundering activities. The 4th factors is environmental factors. Does the user perform the activity from known locations, IP addresses, based on the historical profile? One of our clients, and it is a fun fact, uses altitude indicator on the mobile device to pinpoint attacks from scam centers located in mountainous border areas. So we presume that scammers want to stay away from urban areas in remote locations or closer to the border, so they can quickly cross the border in the event that have to flee. And the 5th element is behavior analysis. A normal user behave differently from a fraudster or a bot. And a user that is under stress also behaves differently from the historical profile of that user. And in addition, when an active call is detected during the setup on a new beneficiary account, it may indicate that the user is receiving instructions over the phone. Of course, one signal in isolation may not provide a full picture, but by combining the signal with other risk signals, we can better assess the risk. Also, the behavior of the user deviates from a normal pattern when the user is on the phone, as the device is moved back and forth between the ear and typing the details of the new beneficiary on the mobile device. And additionally, we use machine learning to further refine scam detection model. The key takeaway from this example is that one risk signal may not provide a conclusive result, but by combining multiple risk signals, we can better create fraud detection strategy. So I will go into a bit more detail in how we actually detect scams. So, and I will elaborate on early example of APP fraud and scams. So we follow the user in a typical login and payment scenario using the conventional fraud detection techniques. So in this case, we observe that the user has been logging in the same device, although the frequency of login has increased. We don't observe anomalies in the location or environment factor using while the user or the individual is using the device. The first anomalies are detected when the user is trying to set up multiple new beneficiary accounts within a short time frame, and the average payment amounts appear to be higher than historical pattern. Another risk factor indicate an elevated risk level, but the results are inconclusive. So using conventional fraud detection techniques that mainly relies on device intelligence, the risk assessment may not produce accurate results. When we apply a layer approach, we can observe red flags more clearly. So in this case, we use the same example, but we analyze additional signals. So one of the additional signal, as we mentioned earlier, may include active call detections. So even though the user is using the same device, we detect an active call during the setup of the new beneficiary account. This may, as I mentioned before, also indicate that the user is being coached over the phone. Analyzing behavior, we produce a more obvious risk signal that the user is being scammed. When the victim is being scammed, the behavior deviates from historical pattern. For instance, the victim is being coached over the phone, and the back and forth handling of the device between holding the phone next to the ear and typing actions resulting in behavior anomalies. Or if the user is using speakerphone, the gyroscope signal do not change during the entire activity. And analyzing the risk profile of the benefits account is another key signal in detecting fraud. In addition to focusing on the user or sender, we analyze the beneficiary account and the recipient and close the risk loop with a two-party payment model approach. So in this example, we noticed that the beneficiary was already marked as fraud in our digital identity network. And we combine all these additional signals into a scam model in a multi-layer approach where we can actually detect scam more accurately. So this diagram visualizes sample reading from the device gyroscope. The additional behavioral biometric signals create unique indicators of risk that we can include in scam detection model. When the user is executing a normal payment, so with an example on the left-hand side, LexisNexis behavior set builds up the user profile for various touch points in the customer journey. So during a scam, we observe that the handling of the device is erratic and deviates from the historical patterns. So when LexisNexis behavior set analyzes the behavior of user, it involves more than just looking at what the user are doing on screen, but also how they interact with the device. For example, the way they hold it and the action of the device. These are 4 key questions or elements that we try to address. Is this a person or a bot? So some bot may be able to mimic human behavior on screen, but the interaction with the device is different from a person that is holding the device. For instance, some fraud syndicates may use click or bot farms to test stolen credentials. These mobile devices are placed on racks, so the gyroscope reading will remain unchanged during the entire activity, which is a giveaway that is highly likely that a bot is operating the device. Is the user a genuine user? So behavior set analyzes the various risk signal against expected and fraudulent behavior to determine whether the user is a genuine user of the account. The third element is user authentication. So in this, is this the same person that is handling the device? Or more specifically, is the current user of the device the same person based on historical behavior pattern? And the last element in scam detection is by combining behavioral analysis and digital intelligence, we can deliver a more effective fraud prevention defense. I have summarized some of the key behavioral biometric signals on this slide. I will briefly walk through them and highlight some of the key ones. So using advanced keyboard shortcuts, such as copy-paste functions, a bad actor may copy credentials from stolen lists and paste it onto forms and fields, for example, while a genuine user has already used this account multiple times and can type in the credential more confidently. Or the user uses autocomplete if it's a recurrent user, while a bad actor does not have these functions, as it is the first time they try out the stolen credential. Also, bad actors are calling off base more often to copy credential from a document or messaging app, for example. And on the mobile side, we have discussed some of the signals in the previous sections. Even if the same device is held by a different user, the behavioral anomalies can be detected. For example, the size of the hands are different, and this affects the hit zone, pressure, the swipe action, and the tap action on screen. So let's look more closely at some of the key fraud scenario. I could spend the whole session on this topic, but I will highlight the key element in each of the use case. In a new account setup scenario where we see the user for the first time, we compare the user behavior against preset or customer specific profile and analyze other suspicious behavior pattern. So leaving the page more often or using advanced commands and shortcut. Also high familiarity with the onboarding process. For instance, a genuine user may take time to go through the instructions and account setup page as they prepare the requested information, while bad actors have gone through this process many times using stolen credentials, so they are very familiar with the flow. Also, when we detect an excessive number of credentials used by from one device, this is another red flag. In account takeover scenario, we can detect that, for example, a remote access port is operational, indicating a potential threat. For example, in the case of a help desk scam, new devices and digital identity are also connected to this account is another red flag. And the robotic behavior when a bot is attempt to mimic the human behavior. Also mismatch between device signal, location, and other data attributes that are associated with this account. We have discussed scam detection using multi-layer approach at length in previous sections, so I move on to the next one. Risk-based authentication is another security layer that is integrated. In most activities, genuine user will go through a seamless experience. However, when behavioral anomalies are detected, an additional layer can be added to authenticate the user in high-risk events. And bots and automation, which we also have covered throughout the session, we analyze their behavior that includes signals such as speed and rhythm of typing, uniformity in typing with little or no mistake, and so on. So this is a recap of the discussion so far. We have this, as we have discussed earlier, preventing scam require a multi-layered approach that includes 6 key elements. And I have organized this element into more logical steps. And the first step, incorporate the classical or fundamental fraud prevention techniques, such as digital intelligence, device intelligence, and transaction monitoring. In the second step, we include more advanced signals, such as active code detection, remote access tool detection, and environmental risk assessment. Behavioral analysis is the third step, and beneficial insight will be the fourth step. And all these risk signals will become part of the scam detection model. In some cases, a bank may go a step further and form a consortium to share additional fraud lists among the member banks. Traditionally, we observe that the compliance professionals rely more on physical intelligence, such as verifying identity document, financial record, and business charters. But with the expansion of online channels, virtual onboarding is now the norm in many fintech businesses. Consumers use their mobile to take selfies and copy of their ID and conduct liveness tests, for instance. Effectively, users create their own digital footprint for online services. And it is where fraud and financial crime compliance intersect. And with the digitalization of services and commercial channel, this process is irreversible. Most of us have online account in some, if not all, key industry listed here. And some financial regulators have also recognized this trend and have started mandating banks to connect the fraud and financial crime compliant technology and processes. I will not go through the details of the regulatory paper, as that is perhaps a topic for a different webinar, but I will highlight two key initiatives whereby local regulators are detailing specific requirements to link fraud and financial crime compliance. Hong Kong Monetary Authority published a guidance paper, Transaction Monitoring, Screening, and Suspicious Transaction Reporting, as recently as February this year, with a specific requirement to include digital footprints of a transaction as part of transaction monitoring process. The Philippines have gone one step further. In the recent circular 1140, the Central Bank of Philippines emphasized the importance of this convergence and require banks to link or integrate their fraud and AML system into comprehensive financial crime prevention system. And with this topic, I will have come to the end of the presentation. Thank you again for listening, and I will hand it back to Manesh.
Thanks a lot, Ty. Very interesting presentation. I can see there's a number of questions from the listeners. I have a few questions of my own, and I guess we still have a bit of time, so we'll try to get through as many of them as we can. For those listening, if you do have additional questions, feel free to continue to feed them through, and we'll try to get through them in the remaining 20 minutes or so we have. Maybe to start, if you don't mind, well, first off, let me just address one of the questions. Somebody asked about the presentation slides. I believe we'll be sending that out to the listeners afterwards.
Yep.
So yeah, just wanted to let everyone know that. So Ty, you talked a bit about the convergence of fraud and financial crime compliance. Can I ask, from your view of the region, how are you seeing banks integrate their fraud and FCC functions? We're used to hearing about banks operating these functions in silos. So I'd like to understand from you whether this is changing. Where do you see the most progress being made? Any particular reasons for this?
Okay. Yes, indeed. If you look at the moment, the discussions around linking fraud and financial crime compliance technology, it's more related to at the technology level. So when you look at, for example, when you look at an entity, you can view it from a compliance or risk perspective, but ultimately it's the same entity. So it does make sense to connect these two silos, technology level that enables both functions to assess risk with a view of 360-degree risk view. As the digitalization process is moving ahead at a faster pace, you can no longer look at risk from a silo perspective. At organization level, the discussion is progressing a bit slower, although we observe that some banks in Singapore have started this conversation. But in other countries, the conversation is still exploratory. Banks are complex and face many challenges. So it will be very challenging for one function to manage such vast compliance and risk domains. Having said that, there will be areas that will remain separate, whether it's a fraud area or financial crime compliance domain. These two areas cover different perspectives of a transaction or event.
Thanks so much. There's quite a few questions about the data that you collect. So I know you talked about digital footprints, how they can show different perspectives of transactions, IP addresses, geolocation data. Can you talk a bit about how you obtain this data? One of the questions was about how do we obtain information from a customer's device? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so our digital identity network is a vast repository of data attributes. So the main challenge is linking and analyzing the connection between the data fragment, because the data itself is basically, a device ID, an email address, but linking all these all these data attributes and make sense of the data that is critical in assessing the risk of an event or transactions. So let me give an example. When a user logs into an account or makes a payment, we analyze hundreds of data attributes from that particular transactions, ranging from the device ID, digital identity, device readings, account details, IP address, geolocation, down to the detail level, such as operating system and screen size. So the important aspect to highlight here is that we don't look at a single risk signal, but the contextual data around it. For instance, if you buy a new phone and reinstall your apps and set up your accounts again, the activity should not be blocked. So even though the device has changed, but the other contextual data remains the same. And it's also important to note that all data is anonymized. What it means is that all data fragments are hashed and cannot be linked to an individual person. The hash is basically a long string of numbers and characters, and it is done to fully comply with data privacy requirements.
So there's a couple questions, and I think we've talked about this before, Ty. But in terms of the behavioral elements of, so the question is about, so if one person uses another person's phone, are you able to sort of detect that there are two different people based on what the examples here are: size of the hand, how the person holds the phone, how they swipe. Another question is asking, can the software distinguish the age of a person based on typing speed, pressure used to tap? Do you want to explain a bit about how that process works and how you're able to detect those differences between users?
Yeah, so when let's assume, okay, so let's explore two scenarios when the same device is passed on to another user. Of course, there will be clear changes in terms of the first change, whether you're left or right-handed. The way you're operating the device is different. Even if you're right-handed and both are right-handed, the way you hold the device, the way you swipe, the way you type will actually build up a different profile of that user. So the other way, the second question that you mentioned about age, no, because what we do, we don't actually attribute a profile to a user, but to a digital identity. So what we do is that we build a profile, historical profile over time of that particular user. Whether you're 1 year old, or obviously 1 year you can operate the device, let's say you're a teenager, or more in more mature age. So, but we do see the difference in terms of behavioral pattern, behavioral analysis profile that is attached to that particular account.
So let's address some of the questions about IP addresses, VPNs. So yeah, with regards to IP addresses, how would you address a situation where a fraudster is trying to obscure their location? So for example, using a VPN. Another question is, can we detect different IP addresses from usual IP addresses used by the original account holder? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that is an interesting question, and it's very much linked to your second question, talking about the contextual data of a particular transaction or events. So when we look data point in isolation, it may not provide an accurate view of the risk. So when a bad actor is using, let's say, location masking techniques, the contextual data around a particular data attribute can provide a better view. For instance, other data attributes we include in the risk analysis may include like digital identity, email, phone numbers, device, beneficiary deal, block list, etc. So all this contextual data will provide, in addition to what we can actually collect in terms of IP and locations. If they're being masked or different locations, we can still look at the contextual data. So the approach is to analyze the risk from multiple signals instead of just a few.
Okay. I was going to ask about sort of how to integrate the sort of data you collect into sort of a bank's workflow. But I noticed there's quite a few questions about LexisNexis and the solution, the platform that you use to for fraud detection and prevention. One question asking, is the system from LexisNexis 100% functioning that will do the prevention action, or whether you need a human staff member to read a report from the system and sort of take a manual action.
Okay.
Another question is asking about, and maybe this expands on it a bit further, but how AI, maybe we'll ask about that after. Yeah, go ahead. Can you talk a bit about LexisNexis, the fraud detection solution?
Yeah, so ThreatMetrix is a cloud-based or solutions. So when I say cloud, it's actually when we actually work with our clients, it's either on, of course, on the desktop or on your mobile app. We have different way of integration. So think of a way of it's a real-time system. So as and when a user or a consumer on your platform is transacting with your website or with the app, we actually risk assess that particular transactions. So there's no manual intervention. And when I say risk assessment, it happens in milliseconds. So when the reason why is that, of course, we have to stop the transaction before it actually go through. So before we actually provide the risk assessment, we already have a risk score that we actually pass it on to the internal system of our client that we work with, and they can actually take then decision whether they accept this kind of analysis or basically pass through for a further review. And that is something that we work with our client to define and to refine this risk model, where we can actually refine the risk model and make it more company specific.
Okay. There are a couple of questions about. So I know that well, I've been told anyway that a lot of the fraud cases or the efforts that are being made by banks maybe in North Asia are really a lot to do with, say for example, credit card fraud, account takeover, maybe some of the more simpler typologies. Can you talk a little bit about some of the more sophisticated types of frauds? How should banks be thinking about scaling into more advanced technologies? One of the questions was asking about the use of artificial intelligence to identify fraud. Another question is asking, how do you identify mule account activity? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so the fraud landscape usually go through a number of stages of maturity, as you will. So bad actors have one aim, getting the most reward with minimal efforts. So the easiest way is to buy or use stolen credentials and use them to take over accounts or create fraudulent new ones. So when businesses implement fraud defenses, this cyber criminal will have to find a different method of attack. They may have to put in more effort by using social engineering tactics and build a storyline for their malicious activities, such as impersonating a bank officer to fish for credentials. In more sophisticated scams, such as investment and romance scam, they may even set up fake website that looks pretty real, or acting as a different persona to trick victims of a romance scam, for example. So in my presentation, I highlight the importance of layering your fraud approach prevention to detect different types of fraud and scams, from the most common type one to more sophisticated scam where behavioral analysis play a critical part in your fraud defense.
One of the one of the interesting questions. I assume you get this a lot, but do you share behavioral data across the LexisNexis community, or is the data client specific?
The behavioral profile is client specific.
Okay. I had a question. So we've heard a lot of the discussion about moving to sort of a mandated liability sharing model I suppose a lot of this discussion is driven out of the UK and EU. How do you see this conversation progressing in Asia Pacific? You know, how do you see it moving forward? Are banks concerned about this? What's your view on it?
Yeah, that is certainly a hot topic. So on this topic, the UK is quite far ahead. In fact, the payment system regulator will implement a requirement next year for banks to show the part of the scam losses. At the moment, I think the split is 50-50. So the victim will bear 50% of the loss and the businesses the other 50%. In APAC, the discussion is still in very early stages. There's some regulators that already have a discussion, like the MAS in Singapore, Monetary Authority in Singapore. Last year, they issued a tentative consulting paper, but that has now been put back to this year, to October, which we can expect hopefully in the next couple of weeks. In other regions, is that it's pretty much the discussion is still very early stages, as I mentioned before, and it's usually more evolved around the unauthorized transactions rather than authorized push payment fraud.
Okay, there's a question about passwords, using passwords on your personal devices. I suppose it's, yeah, what's your view on the use of passwords and whether they should be stored on personal devices?
I think that is a bit more on IT security rather than in terms of fraud detection. So I think, yeah, I mean, it's not best practice actually to store your password anywhere. So, but as I mentioned before, it's more an IT security discussion than a fraud discussion matter.
Sorry, I'm just jumping around a bit, trying to get to all the questions. One is about crypto investment scams, very common now. What's the best way to identify if the person is a real investor on crypto or just trying to scam you? I don't know if you have a view on this.
Yeah, so whether it's a investment scam with cryptocurrency or with another monetary unit, I think the behavior pattern, the behavior analysis of around a particular user, that will give away some of the key risk signal. For example, of course, the first step is to analyze, of course, whether you are dealing with, you know, a legitimate entity. For example, that is a requirement, or that's a more personal responsibility. But beyond that, I think in terms of how you behave online, whether it's a malicious actor or a genuine user, the behavior will be different. So if you look at the typical risk signals from a typical genuine user or let's say a cyber criminal, it's very different in terms of how they behave around the device. As I mentioned before, if you have already logged into your device multiple times, you're very familiar, right? So you may use your autocomplete or you type in your credential quite confidently. But if this is the first time that you're trying to do that using stolen credential, that's where you see some of the anomalies from the normal behavior patterns.
Okay. There's one question about, I guess this more asks about how certain you are when it comes to being able to link a transaction to fraud. How can we ensure the data you obtained and showed as suspicious or actually linked to fraud?
Okay, so that's a very good question. So before we actually implement or actually roll out this, the technology, is that we work with our team, with our clients, to actually define different levels. So it's not just, you know, define the risk score, but also where you see the higher risk point. And this is where we actually build the touch point, where we actually assess the risk at the different touch points. So it could be a login, could be a new account opening, and within login there are multiple levels. For example, change of details, change of your email address, change of your phone number. On the beneficiary side, whether you update your beneficiary account, adding new one or deleting new one. So these are some of the touch points that we work with our client to define what are the key risks and define what level of risk is acceptable and what level of risk is perhaps a high risk, consider high risk. So our solution is not one size fits all. So we work with individual clients to actually define this kind of threshold.
There's a question about the turnaround time for determining whether a transaction is fraudulent based on the identity of the beneficiary account using the LexisNexis Global Identity Network.
Yeah, the turnaround time, as I mentioned, is near real time. And when I say near real time, it's a matter of milliseconds. So of course, between the point of our solution and the point of client, there could be multiple factors. For example, if you use ISP, if you use other routing technology. So, but usually it's within real time in a matter of milliseconds.
There's a question about the role of fraud prevention strategies to support open finance initiatives. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, open finance is a term that is used quite often nowadays, open banking, open finance, etc. So we do have a concept where we already, in a way, we work with some of our banks, what we call the consortium, where we already shared information, where we share, let's say, block list, device that are being flagged, beneficial account are being flagged, etc. So that is a form of, in a way, but it's more within the closed group.
Okay. There's a question kind of going back to you mentioned earlier that the data is client specific. The question is around what data is actually shared across the LexisNexis community or across the wider bank network. Is there any sort of data that is kind of mutualized or shared within your platform?
So the digital identity network is not, in a way, it's not a sharing platform. So it's not a lookup tool, if that's what the question is. So imagine is a vast repository of data points. So as and when you transact with from A to B, let's say you transfer money to another account, that is when we actually risk assess. So we look at, for example, the device. Has this device been flagged in our digital identity network? Has the beneficiary account been flagged in our identity network? And if some of these risk signals are high, we can actually adjust some of the risk scoring methodology as I mentioned before, and work together with our client to define this kind of risk model. So it's not what you mentioned, like sharing in a way that we share the data, but it's more repository data where we can actually test or risk assess some of the attribute, the risk attribute that based on the transactions. So the data attribute for new account opening is very different from, for example, payment or for login. So it's not like the same set of data that will be assessed, but different sets of data.
Okay, and maybe as a final question, do you want to talk a little bit about how you're using AI to help identify frauds and analyze transactions?
Yeah, so we do use machine learning model, machine learning to actually define the model. Of course, because we talk about a lot of volume, a lot of transaction volume that is almost impossible to actually look into detail and manually. So we use machine learning model to refine some detection model, and some of these models are more industry specific and also specific to use cases, whether, as I mentioned before, a new account creation, login, or payment. And these are different sets of models that we actually deploy.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. I think we got to almost all of the questions, but unfortunately we're out of time. Ty, I'd like to thank you for your time today and for sharing all this information. I'm sure it was very useful for all the bankers on the call. So once again, Tan Tai Vo is Director of Market Planning for Fraud and Identity for APAC at LexisNexis Risk Solutions. His contact details will be made available in case you have further questions or you'd like to reach out to him. Again, I'd like to thank both LexisNexis Risk Solutions and Asian Bankers Association for putting this event together. And once again, may I remind you about the ABA conference in Kathmandu, Nepal on November 9th and 10th. Again, feel free to look at the website for the event for more information. Thank you very much. Once again, I see there are some more questions streaming in. I'm sure we'll be able to address some of them by email. Ty, certainly we have about 30 questions or so from the listeners altogether. So certainly I think that means that you've made it a very engaging discussion.
Yeah, I'm happy to address them offline.
Okay. I guess we'll end it here. Thanks once again, Ty, very much for today, and to all our listeners for dialing in. Wish everyone a nice rest of your day, and speak to you all again soon. Thanks very much.
Thank you.